Fire, Captain. Engineering. Situation critical.
All available personnel on the double. Spock with me.
Star Trek 1966. 20 weird facts you didn't know. No one was supposed to talk about. A television captain almost never existed. A network tried to kill the most famous kiss in science fiction history before it aired. And one of the most beloved space vehicles in pop culture was never finished on the bottom because nobody ever thought a camera would look under there. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll never watch a rerun of the original Star Trek the same way again. Long before Marvel took over multiplexes, before streaming platforms fought each other for subscribers, before a fandom could organize a movement with a single hashtag, there was a scrappy, underfunded science fiction show that nobody in charge actually believed in. It debuted on September 8, 1966. Critics shrugged. Ratings were forgettable. The special effects budget wouldn't cover a modern commercial. And somehow, out of that unpromising mix, came one of the most quietly influential pieces of television ever produced. What follows are 20 stories from behind the cameras that rarely make it into the highlight reels. The accidents, near misses, and quiet acts of defiance that shaped a franchise nobody expected to survive its first cancellation, let alone outlive most of the people who made it. Let's start with the captain, who almost wasn't Kirk at all. When Gene Roddenberry first shopped his idea to NBC, William Shatner wasn't even part of the conversation. The network had already agreed to a different leading man. Jeffrey Hunter, an actor best known at the time for portraying Jesus in the 1961 film King of Kings. Hunter shot an entire pilot episode as Captain Christopher Pike, playing the role as quiet, thoughtful, and restrained, closer to Roddenberry's original vision of a commander than the character Star Trek eventually became known for. Then, before a second episode could be filmed, Hunter walked away from the project entirely. The reasons have never been fully agreed upon. Some accounts point to his wife discouraging a television commitment. Others suggest Hunter simply didn't see a future in the role. Either way, the part opened up, and William Shatner stepped into it with a completely different energy, more theatrical, more impulsive, more willing to throw the rulebook out the airlock. It's strange to think the entire tone of one of fiction's most enduring heroes hinged on one actor's change of heart. Hunter never got to see what the franchise became. He died in 1969, only 3 years after that pilot was shelved. The character who arguably came to define Star Trek even more than its captain almost looked nothing like the Spock audiences know. Roddenberry's earliest notes described a half-alien science officer with reddish, almost menacing skin, a look meant to feel genuinely unsettling, closer to something demonic than diplomatic. Concept art from the period leaned into exactly that idea. But there was a practical problem standing in the way. In 1966, the majority of American households were still watching television in black and white, not color. On a black and white screen, a deep red tone would have registered as murky, almost black, sending a visual signal the production never intended. So the team shifted course, landing on a subtler yellow-green tint that read as alien without looking sinister. Ironically, once color sets became more common, most viewers barely registered the tint at all. What actually sold the character's otherness were the ears, simple, pointed, and unforgettable. If Spock's look was a compromise, the transporter was practically an act of desperation. Ask any fan to name their favorite piece of Star Trek technology, and the transporter usually tops the list. The idea of breaking a human body down at the molecular level and reconstructing it somewhere else entirely. It sounds like visionary science fiction. In reality, it was a budget workaround. The original plan called for the crew to travel to and from planets using a shuttlecraft, complete with launch sequences and landings. That would have looked spectacular on screen, and it would have cost far more than the show could afford on a weekly basis. So the production team needed something cheaper, and they found it, a shimmering visual effect created by filming sparkling particles falling in front of a dark backdrop, then playing the footage in reverse. It cost a fraction of what a shuttle sequence would have required, and it became one of the most iconic images in science fiction history. Decades later, physicists still get asked whether teleportation is theoretically possible, all tracing back to a production crew that simply couldn't afford to build a spaceship. Even getting the show onto the air at all was a fight. The first pilot episode, The Cage, was submitted to NBC executives in 1965, and the response was blunt. Too slow, too intellectual, not enough action. Network notes reportedly also took issue with a female first officer character, played by Majel Barrett, in a position of authority, apparently too unconventional for television executives of that era to embrace. NBC passed on the pilot outright. What happened next was almost unheard of. Rather than shelving the project, the network commissioned a second pilot. Roddenberry went back to the drawing board, retooled the crew, sharpened the pacing, and introduced the character lineup audiences would come to know: Kirk, Spock, and a faster, punchier tone overall. He didn't let the rejected pilot go to waste, either. Years later, its footage was repurposed into a two-part episode called The Menagerie, which went on to win a Hugo Award, making a once-rejected pilot into award-winning television. One of the show's most quietly important cast members almost didn't stick around long enough to become an icon. Nichelle Nichols, who played Communications Officer Lieutenant Uhura, was doing something genuinely rare for American television in the 1960s, portraying a black woman in a role defined by authority and competence rather than servitude. But after the first season, she was ready to leave the show behind in favor of a return to Broadway, and she submitted her resignation to Roddenberry. Then, at an NAACP fundraising event, she found herself face-to-face with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who told her how much the character meant to him. He explained that for the first time, young black viewers could watch television and see someone who looked like them treated as a respected professional serving among the stars. Nichols withdrew her resignation the very next day, and she spoke for the rest of her life about how that single conversation reshaped her understanding of what her role actually meant. Leonard Nimoy, meanwhile, wasn't entirely sure Spock was a character worth playing at all, at least not at first. His hesitation centered on the ears and the alien complexion. He worried the look would tip the character into unintentional comedy or make him read as a monster rather than a hero audiences could connect with. There was also the deeper acting challenge. Nimes was a trained, expressive performer being asked to play someone who deliberately suppressed almost all outward emotion, which meant unlearning many of his own instincts as an actor. What changed his mind was the audience response. Rather than seeing a cold or off-putting figure, viewers picked up on the tension underneath, a character wrestling with emotion rather than lacking it entirely. Nimoy's own relationship with the role tells the story in miniature. His first memoir was titled I Am Not Spock, his second, years later, I Am Spock. Few single moments in the show's run carry more cultural weight than the kiss shared by Kirk and Uhura in November 1968 episode Plato's Stepchildren, widely cited as among the first interracial kisses shown on American primetime television. What's less commonly discussed is how hard network executives pushed back before it aired. NBC reportedly wanted the moment reframed so that the characters were being forced into the kiss by telepathic alien manipulation rather than choosing it themselves, a framing that would have given uncomfortable affiliates an easy way to dismiss what they were seeing. According to accounts from the production, Shatner and Nichols intentionally muddled the alternate takes that kept their faces apart, effectively steering the director toward using the take where the two actors turned naturally toward each other. The network still got its in-story justification. The actors got the moment they wanted on screen anyway. Nichols later described receiving a letter from a viewer in the South who said watching that scene had forced him to reconsider assumptions he'd carried his entire life. Star Trek was never a ratings powerhouse, and more than once it came close to simply disappearing. After its first season, network executives were already discussing cancellation. After the second, those conversations grew louder. What happened in response had almost no precedent in television at the time: organized fan resistance. Letter-writing campaigns generated an enormous volume of mail to NBC's offices, petitions circulated on college campuses, and supporters even gathered outside network headquarters. All without the internet, without social media, using nothing but postage stamps and persistence. It worked. NBC renewed the show for a third season, a decision even announced publicly at a science fiction convention, in what's often pointed to as one of the earliest examples of organized audience pressure visibly reversing a network's plans. That third season, however, arrived with a reduced budget and a punishing late Friday night time slot, and the show was ultimately canceled in 1969. But that additional season gave the show just enough episodes to qualify for syndication. And syndication is where everything changed. The USS Enterprise itself carried its own quiet secret. The original 11-foot filming model, one of the most recognizable spacecraft designs in fiction, was painstakingly detailed on every surface a camera might realistically capture. The hull, the saucer section, the nacelles. The underside, however, was left largely unfinished, since virtually every shot was framed from above or from the side, and there was no budget to spend detailing surfaces the audience would never see on screen. The model now resides in the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and if you could flip it over, you'd find a rough, unpainted underside of one of the most iconic vehicles in entertainment history. And then there's the line everyone remembers that was, technically, never spoken. "Beam me up." Scotty has been printed on shirts, mugs, and bumper stickers for half a century, and it's so tightly associated with the show that it feels almost impossible that it isn't real. But across the entire original series and its film sequels, that exact phrase was never uttered. What Kirk actually says across various episodes includes lines like "beam us up," "Scotty, Scotty," "beam us up," "fast," and "beam me up" without the name attached at all. Close variations, but never the precise combination that became a cultural shorthand. This kind of misremembered quote is more common than most people realize. Play it again. Sam doesn't appear in Casablanca in that form. Elementary. My dear Watson never shows up in Arthur Conan Doyle's original stories. Even Darth Vader's most famous line is usually misquoted. He says, "No, I am your father." Not Luke, "I am your father." Sometimes the version we remember collectively becomes more powerful than whatever was actually said. The show's alien wardrobe had its own behind-the-scenes shortcut. Every week, the crew of the Enterprise seemed to encounter entirely new civilizations with their own distinct fashion. Exotic robes, strange armor, elaborate ceremonial dress. In reality, a significant portion of that alien clothing began its life as ordinary studio costume stock, pulled from the enormous wardrobe archives that Hollywood studios maintained across decades of film and television production. Roman-style garments were repainted into ceremonial alien robes. Old Western costumes were reworked into the clothing of distant civilizations. Aging science fiction B-movie suits got fresh paint jobs and new insignia. Sharp-eyed viewers occasionally spotted the same costume piece reappearing across wildly different productions, repurposed just enough to feel new. It was resourceful, low-budget costuming that relied on the fact that a television audience only needed the illusion to hold for a few seconds at a time. The phaser followed a similar path. Starfleet's iconic sidearm, capable of stunning or vaporizing a target, depending on its setting, actually began as a batch of inexpensive prop ray guns already sitting in the studio's inventory, leftover novelty items from earlier, lower-budget productions. The design team modified them with new paint, added detailing, and extra components to make them look more sophisticated and futuristic. Under close inspection, some of that plastic origin was still visible, but under studio lighting and paired with the right sound design, the illusion worked perfectly well for television. There's a strange afterlife to that prop, too. Decades of real-world research into directed energy weapons have drawn direct, conceptual inspiration from the phaser, meaning a dressed-up toy gun helped plant the seed for genuine military research programs. Not every low-budget solution went smoothly, though. The 1967 episode The Trouble with Tribbles is remembered as one of the show's most purely fun installments, built around small, purring, rapidly multiplying fuzzy creatures overrunning the Enterprise. What audiences didn't see was the headache those props caused off camera. The Tribbles were built from synthetic fur wrapped around foam cores, with small motors tucked inside some of them to simulate purring. Under the intense heat of studio lighting, that synthetic fur generated significant static electricity, causing the props to cling to costumes, furniture, and equipment, and giving crew members the occasional unwanted shock. With hundreds of tribbles needed for certain scenes, the production had to develop a system for discharging static buildup between takes just to keep filming moving. The show also accidentally gave television a piece of permanent storytelling vocabulary. Anyone familiar with genre fiction knows what a red shirt is. The disposable side character who beams down with the main cast and doesn't survive the episode. Star Trek didn't invent the idea of an expendable supporting character, but it did give that trope both its name and its visual shorthand. In the show's color-coded uniform system, red was worn by engineering and security personnel, exactly the crew members most likely to be sent into dangerous situations on away missions. Over the show's run, minor characters in red uniforms did die at a noticeably disproportionate rate compared to other departments, a pattern fans have tracked and discussed for decades. The show never called attention to it directly. It simply became something audiences absorbed episode after episode until red shirt entered the broader cultural vocabulary, showing up today in everything from screenwriting discussions to corporate slang. The franchise's most famous rivals weren't always its biggest threat. Ask most people who Star Trek signature villains are, and the Klingon come up almost immediately. The proud warrior culture that eventually evolved from enemy to uneasy ally across later series and films. But in the original run, the Klingon were a secondary concern. The Romulans appeared first, introduced in the acclaimed episode Balance of Terror, and were positioned as the more prominent antagonists early on, calculating, secretive, and governed by their own rigid code of honor, often read by critics as a reflection of Cold War-era anxieties about the Soviet Union. The Klingon, introduced later, came across as more directly aggressive and militaristic, a different flavor of the same geopolitical unease. It was really the subsequent films and especially the Next Generation that elevated the Klingon into the dominant cultural force they're remembered as today.